My name is Lily Harmon. I'm a 28-year-old creative strategist and majority owner of a regional brand agency living in Houston, Texas, and the Christmas night that changed everything started with an apron, a serving tray, and a single sentence that was meant to humiliate me in front of a room full of people who were already laughing before the words had finished leaving my brother's mouth. What none of them knew, not my brother, not my father, not my stepmother, not the girlfriend he had draped across his arm like a designer accessory, was that I had already spent months building the exact reckoning they deserved. And I had it loaded in my pocket, ready to send with one thumb, the moment any of them gave me the excuse. That moment came faster than I expected. But before I tell you what happened in that living room, and what that phone call did to my brother's face, and how a single Christmas dinner unraveled years of lies my own father had buried inside paperwork he thought I'd never find, I need you to understand how we got there. Because stories like this don't begin at the dinner table. They begin in the years before, in the quiet accumulation of 1,000 small cruelties that a family performs on the child they've decided to stop protecting. This one began the year my mother died. Her name was Carol Harmon, and she was the kind of woman who tucked handwritten notes into your lunch bag and rubbed your shoulders when you stayed up too late studying for tests she knew you were going to pass anyway. She was patient and specific and warm in a way that made the whole house feel like it had a pulse. When she was diagnosed with breast cancer, she was 41 years old and I was 14. The disease moved quickly and quietly, the way the worst things do, rearranging everything inside our home before any of us had learned how to grieve what we still had. One year I had a mother. The next year I was standing beside a casket in a black dress that scratched my neck, listening to adults tell me I was strong when what they actually meant was that they needed me not to fall apart in front of them. My father, Robert, did not stay alone for long. 6 months after we buried my mother, he brought home a woman named Sandra with polished nails, scented candles, fresh curtains for every window, and a smile that always sounded warm until you replayed her words later and noticed the blade hidden inside every sentence. She moved into our house with her son Derek, who was 3 years younger than me, and immediately installed at the center of the universe like a sun everyone was expected to orbit. Derek was loud, athletic, effortlessly charming, and almost frighteningly skilled at reading a room and becoming whatever version of himself that room most wanted to see. My father lit up around him in a way I hadn't witnessed since before my mother got sick. The house found a new rhythm almost immediately, and I was not part of the beat. Derek had football camp, new cleats, birthday parties with rented bounce houses, and a bottomless supply of excuses whenever he broke something or missed something or let someone down. I had chores, hand-me-down clothes from church donation drives, and lengthy lectures about attitude whenever I so much as asked why I was the only one expected to clear the dinner table. If I pointed out that Derek had tracked mud through the kitchen again, Sandra would watch him tear through the house like a natural disaster and laugh, genuinely laugh, the way people laugh at something they find charming. Then she would turn to me with a settled, patient expression and say, "Lily, you are the girl in this house. Start acting like it." She said it the way people say grace before a meal, like a ritual no one was permitted to question. My father never corrected her. He had developed a habit that was somehow worse than outright dismissal. Whenever I pushed back, whenever I asked for something, whenever I pointed at the gap between what Derek received and what I was offered, my father would sigh deeply, lean back in his chair and say, "Not now, Lily. Derek has a lot going on this season." As if my needs were a scheduling conflict. As if everything I wanted kept arriving at the wrong moment in Derek's calendar. At dinner, the best cuts of meat landed on Derek's plate first. On Christmas mornings he opened more gifts and bigger ones, while I practiced looking grateful over scarves, practical notebooks, and drugstore gift sets. Sandra praised him in front of everyone who would listen. She would say things like, "Derek is going to do something extraordinary one day," and then glance at me and add almost gently, "Lily is still finding herself." It became the household language. Derek was potential. I was delay. Derek was momentum. I was complication. He got brighter with every year that passed. I got quieter because quietness was the only currency that bought me any peace. The most dangerous thing about hearing the same diminished version of yourself repeated inside your own home for years is that you eventually stop arguing with it. You begin wearing it the way you wear a coat you didn't choose. By the time I was 17, I had mastered the art of making myself smaller at the dinner table, softer in conversation, easier to overlook. That was how peace worked in our house. And the worst part, the part that took me years to name clearly, was that they didn't just need Derek to succeed. They needed me to fail, or at least to appear to be failing, because my smallness was the shadow that made him look even taller. When I was 16, my school counselor pulled me aside and told me I had a strong portfolio for a competitive state summer arts program. She said I had a real shot. I came home that afternoon more excited than I had been in months, holding the application like it was something fragile. I found my father scrolling his phone at the kitchen counter while Sandra chopped celery for a casserole. I laid the application between them and started explaining the scholarship component before I lost my nerve. Sandra barely glanced at it. My father asked what dates the program ran. When I told him, he frowned and said that overlapped with Derek's regional football camp. I didn't understand the connection until Sandra said, perfectly pleasantly, "We can't split the budget right now, and we definitely can't be in two places at once. Derek's camp matters for his future. You can do art anytime. You can do art anytime." Like my dreams were a hobby with flexible scheduling. Like my future was something that could keep being rescheduled to accommodate his. The same pattern repeated itself in every possible form for the next 2 years. Derek got driving lessons in a newer truck because he needed confidence on the road. I rode the bus because it was good for me to learn responsibility. He got private tutoring before finals because academic pressure hit athletes especially hard. I was told to study at the kitchen table after the dishes were done. On his 18th birthday, my father gave him floor seats to a Texans game and an engraved watch he showed to everyone he met for the following 3 weeks. That same year, I asked whether I could replace my dying laptop before senior year because I needed it for my design coursework and college applications. Sandra told me the public library was an underutilized resource, and that I should try relying less on convenience. She said this while Derek was upstairs playing video games on a flat-screen television that had been purchased for him because he had been, quote, stressed after a difficult season. Derek had understood the system from an early age. He knew he could say almost anything to me as long as he smiled afterward and kept his voice light. He liked introducing me at school events with small throwaway jokes. "This is my sister Lily. She's into artsy stuff, still figuring life out." Or sometimes with that particular grin that made people think cruelty was just personality. "Lily is the reason my parents pray so hard about my future." People laughed because he was handsome and at ease, and because family cruelty is almost completely invisible when it's wrapped in enough charisma. He started treating my imagined failures as entertainment even before I had actually failed at anything. At dinner he would make broad statements about how some people were simply built for real pressure and others weren't. My father never asked him to stop. Sandra would say, "Derek, be nice," in the same tone people used to comment on weather, present, meaningless, and immediately forgotten. And somewhere inside that atmosphere of polished family performance, I started believing something deeply poisonous. That maybe love was something you had to outperform someone else to deserve. That if I were more impressive, more naturally easy to brag about, my father would finally stop looking through me. But homes like that don't work that way. They don't want the neglected child to rise. They need her to stay just wounded enough to keep the hierarchy intact. My college acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in spring, and for about 10 full minutes I felt taller than I had in years. It wasn't an elite institution. It was the State University in Texas, a design and communications program with a partial scholarship attached. But it felt like a door opening in a wall I had been pressing against for years. I read the letter 10 times before taking it downstairs. My hands were shaking. I knew better than to expect a celebration. I still hoped for something. A hug. A sentence that sounded even remotely like pride. My father read the first page, nodded once, and handed it back. "That's good," he said. Then he asked whether the scholarship covered housing. It didn't fully. I told him I could work and take out a small loan. He and Sandra exchanged a look I understood in my bones before either of them said a word. Derek had just been accepted to a private university outside Dallas through a sports-linked admissions track. They had already decided where the money was going. He needed the full dorm package, the meal plan, the better laptop, the truck for travel. All of it. They didn't say that directly. What Sandra said was that this was actually a wonderful opportunity for me to develop real independence, because not every student benefits from the traditional college path, unless they are truly ready for it. What my father said was that Derek had more momentum right now, and it made sense to invest where the return would be strongest. Return. That was the word he chose. Like parenthood was venture capital and I had already come back below projection. So I adjusted because that was what I had always done. I enrolled anyway. I found a cheap room to rent near a bus line with 2 other girls I barely knew. I got a part-time job at a coffee shop and picked up weekend shifts at a diner when rent got tight. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself hardship built character. I told myself I would look back one day and feel proud. What I didn't know yet was how different resilience looks when you're climbing uphill without a safety net, while your own family quietly cuts the rope. The bus rides before sunrise. The shifts that ran late enough to leave my feet numb during morning lectures. The group projects with classmates whose parents were paying their car insurance and their meal plans while I was counting quarters for laundry. I tried to hold on. I carried a sketchbook and a planner and a stubborn belief that effort would eventually become stability if I kept applying it long enough. Then my housing fell apart halfway through my second semester. The landlord announced he was selling the property. I had 30 days to move, almost no savings, and a class schedule already hanging by a thread. I called my father and asked if I could come home for just a few months while I figured out a plan. He didn't say yes or no. He asked whether I had considered that maybe college wasn't the right fit for me after all. Sandra got on the phone and told me that forcing myself into environments that clearly overwhelmed me wasn't bravery. It was stubbornness. Then she said something I never once forgot. Derek is built for high-pressure paths. You do better when life is simpler. As if my limitations were biological. As if they had nothing to do with the years of neglect that had left me without the support system that most students quietly rely on without ever naming it. I withdrew 2 weeks later. Not because I was incapable. Because I couldn't solve every structural problem with grit alone. I packed my clothes into garbage bags and moved into a tiny efficiency apartment above a 24-hour diner where the walls vibrated whenever the industrial freezer kicked on downstairs. The place smelled like old grease and industrial detergent. The mattress sagged in the center like it had made peace with failure. It was what I could afford. I cried exactly once that first night. Even then it felt less like grief than humiliation. Derek texted me before midnight. He had already heard. Of course he had. The message read, "Heard you dropped out. Knew it was only a matter of time. Do us all a favor and don't turn this into another pity thing." I stared at those words until my screen went dark. He was already narrating me as a cautionary tale. I was becoming the example they would use at every future family gathering to make him look more disciplined by comparison. The daughter who couldn't hack it. The sister with potential she wasted. The proof that some people are just not built for certain things. What none of them understood was that something inside me had not died in that apartment above the diner. Something had finally, quietly stopped asking their permission to exist. When you lose the version of your life you were told would save you, you either collapse under the shame or you start building with whatever is still left in your hands. I had no degree, no family money, no safety net, and no one rushing in with a rescue plan. What I had was anger, talent, and a tolerance for hard work that none of them had ever bothered to notice because noticing it would have complicated the story they needed to tell about me. That apartment was the first place that was entirely mine. Nobody there knew my history. Nobody compared me to Derek. Nobody required me to stay small so someone else could look large. I worked morning shifts at the coffee shop 3 days a week and late shifts at the diner on weekends. Everything in between went toward figuring out how to turn what I knew into something people would actually pay for. I started small and borderline embarrassing. A logo for a local barbecue stand trying to look less like a place people only visited by accident. Flyers for a mobile car wash guy who paid me in cash and smoked through the entire consultation. A basic social media package for a nail salon owner who kept apologizing that she couldn't offer more than $200. I said yes to everything. Not because I lack standards. Because survival doesn't wait for dignity to arrange itself into neat stages. Every client taught me something. Every cheap project forced me to sharpen faster than any classroom would have. I spent nights watching free tutorials on branding, digital advertising, audience psychology, search optimization, content strategy, and campaign analytics. I borrowed books from the public library until the librarian started recognizing me and recommending titles before I asked. I learned how small businesses actually thought because I was working with people who couldn't afford pretty mistakes. They needed results, not theory. And giving them results meant I had to understand the gap between what looked good and what actually worked. My first real breakthrough came from a family-owned barbecue restaurant near downtown Houston. The food was extraordinary. The online presence looked like it had been abandoned around 2011. I offered them a low-cost rebrand. New visuals, better menu photography, local ad targeting built around football weekends and neighborhood loyalty, and a social campaign with enough warmth that people felt like regulars before they'd walk through the door. Within 2 months, their weekend revenue had jumped significantly enough that the owner hugged me in the parking lot while crying into his apron strings. And I understood for the first time in years what it felt like to have someone treat my work like actual value instead of a phase I was going through. Word spread. Then more word spread. A sporting goods store. A boutique fitness studio. A contractor who wanted to look established enough to bid on larger commercial jobs. Then a regional account with real money and expectations that scared me in exactly the right way. That was when I met Marcus Hale. He came to me through a referral chain that started with one of my smaller accounts. Marcus was everything Derek liked to perform, being calm under pressure, genuinely strategic, impossible to impress with noise, and exceptionally good at recognizing real capability in people who were used to being underestimated. He had spent years in brand operations and business development at a mid-size agency, and was leaving a partnership that had stopped fitting him. Our first meeting was scheduled for 45 minutes. We stayed nearly 3 hours, scribbling frameworks on coffee shop napkins, talking about why so many modern agencies felt bloated and disconnected from the actual businesses they claimed to serve. Marcus didn't talk over me. He didn't repackage my ideas in a lower register and call it leadership. He listened, then pushed back, then listened again. It was one of the most genuinely respectful professional conversations I had ever experienced, and it was unsettling in the way that good things are unsettling when you're not yet used to them. Over the following year, we collaborated project by project until the line between informal partnership and actual company became impossible to ignore. We launched Apex Creative Group together, Marcus as the public-facing chief executive because he liked the front of the room and I genuinely didn't. And I built everything underneath that front: the systems, the creative architecture, the client strategy, the internal workflows, the operational discipline that people with expensive degrees like to claim as their exclusive domain. Marcus opened doors. I built what came through them. We structured the company carefully. Because most of the original capital came from my existing client base, my retained accounts, and my decision to reinvest everything I earned rather than pay myself comfortably, I became majority shareholder. Very few people outside our legal and finance team knew the full ownership breakdown. That wasn't secrecy for drama's sake. It was a deliberate boundary. I had spent enough of my life being interpreted and dismissed by people who only valued what they could see and verify through someone else's approval. I didn't need public applause. I needed control. At family gatherings, the occasional ones I still attended out of some stubborn remnant of hope, when anyone asked what I did, my father would say, "Lily does freelance design stuff." He always made it sound temporary, slightly embarrassing, like something people do between real jobs. Derek had graduated by then, and was moving through the world with the particular confidence of a man who had always assumed the world would organize itself around his potential. He talked about networking, brand culture, leadership pipelines, and market visibility like he had personally invented the concept of ambition. Sandra repeated every update about his career to extended relatives, as if each new job title were a civic achievement worth announcing. They had the same blind spot they had always had. They assumed that because I was quiet I was still lost. They did not know that while they were still describing me as someone who had never recovered from dropping out, I had built a company with real staff, expanding accounts, and regional campaigns that were genuinely moving the needle for clients who could have gone anywhere. And they absolutely did not know that one day Derek would apply to work there and walk straight into a building I owned. Derek didn't get into Apex because of brilliance. He got in the way men like him have always gotten in, by converting confidence into access. He met someone at an alumni event, followed up twice with the right language, polished his resume until it gleamed with borrowed vocabulary, and landed an interview for a mid-level brand strategy role. Marcus handled the initial stages. By the time the candidate packet came through internal review and I saw the name on the file, I sat back in my chair for a very long time and stared at the screen while old anger and new opportunity met inside the same breath. Marcus looked at me from across the desk. You want me to reject him outright? I said no. Not out of generosity. Because I wanted to see what happened when Derek entered a space where my standards, not my father's affections, not Sandra's narratives, set the rules. Derek started at Apex the way he had started at every room he'd ever entered. Like he'd been cast in a film about future executives. Crisp shirts, expensive watch, smile calibrated to project effortless authority, working the room by making intense eye contact with people he calculated as important and barely registering the ones he didn't. He didn't recognize me the first week because I wasn't introduced as founder or owner. To him, I was simply a senior strategist moving between meetings with a laptop and no visible need to impress anyone. The irony of that was something I genuinely enjoyed for a few days. When he finally placed me, he had the minimal decency to look startled, but not nearly enough humility to actually adjust. Instead, he recalibrated. Inside the office, he kept things professionally neutral. Outside meetings and in team chat threads, he was doing what he had always done. He told coworkers stories about his sister who had tried college, flamed out, and was now doing okay in some design support capacity. He never technically lied. He did something far more precise. He arranged the truth into a shape that made him look superior and me look safely small and unthreatening. Mia arrived in the picture around the same time, stylish, sharp, and initially easier to like than I wanted her to be. Derek paraded her through his life as evidence he was leveling up. The right restaurants, the right rooftop captions, the right language about building a future with someone who matched his vision. He had always loved performing for an audience. Apex gave him a new one. For a few months, he performed competently enough to remain unremarkable. Then he got impatient. That was always his fundamental flaw. Years of being praised on schedule had trained him to expect upward motion as a right. When promotions and recognition didn't materialize as quickly as he felt he deserved, he started manufacturing them. The first sign was subtle, speaking too confidently in client meetings about concepts he hadn't developed. Then one of our designers mentioned that Derek had asked for access to shared folders outside his project scope. Then an analyst flagged irregular line items on a vendor reconciliation sheet, small amounts, vague descriptions, the kind of thing that looks like rounding errors until you see the pattern. None of it was dramatic in isolation. But patterns rarely announce themselves all at once. They gather slowly. They repeat. They wait for someone who understands systems to connect the dots. I connected them. So did Marcus. We watched quietly. We didn't confront him early because people like Derek are most revealing, most incriminating, when they believe they're getting away with something. Then one Tuesday morning, Derek posted on LinkedIn about a breakthrough campaign he was proud to have led. He included images. He used language about vision and execution and client transformation. My stomach dropped the moment I saw the first slide. The concept, the visual hierarchy, the emotional framing, the structural logic of the copy, it was pulled directly from a strategy deck I had drafted weeks earlier for an internal pitch meeting. He hadn't improved it. He hadn't adapted it. He had stolen it with the particular arrogance of someone who assumes the real creator has no power. Marcus came into my office 10 minutes later carrying a printed screenshot and closed the door behind him without being asked. We pulled the access logs. Derek had entered folders outside his authorization level, downloaded source files, renamed document versions to obscure the trail, and deleted 2 supporting files he believed would eliminate the evidence chain. He had also submitted a series of consulting reimbursements to a shell vendor account. Small amounts, carefully spaced, designed to stay beneath casual financial review, that routed money back into an account connected to him. The total wasn't catastrophic in corporate terms. The intent was. The reimbursements had financed things that fed his image. A custom piece of jewelry, truck payments, high-end dinners he was photographing for his social media. But the theft that hit hardest wasn't the money. One of our junior staff members came to Marcus with screenshots from internal team messaging channels where Derek had joked openly about having to rescue his sister's half-baked ideas, because she had never really understood how strategy actually worked at a professional level. He had said this to colleagues who worked inside a company I owned. He was still doing what he had always done, taking what I built, diminishing what I survived, and using both to decorate his own image. Marcus asked again, quietly, whether I wanted him terminated privately and quickly. I said no. For the first time in my life, I did not want the quiet version. I didn't want the discreet exit, the polished severance, The version where he walked away shaken but intact. I wanted proportion. I wanted the room. We spent the next several days building a complete evidence file. Access logs with timestamps, document version histories, deleted file recovery, reimbursement trails traced back to their destination accounts, internal witness statements, chat screenshots, and enough legal corroboration to make any attorney in the country feel confident proceeding. Then a second truth surfaced. Older. Uglier. And it changed everything. While reviewing financial records connected to some paperwork my Aunt Diane had mentioned years ago, a passing reference to an education fund my maternal grandparents had established, I found traces of a custodial account in my name that had been nearly drained during the exact years that Derek's private university tuition, his housing, his vehicle costs, and his various lifestyle upgrades were being covered without apparent strain on the household budget. The timing was too clean. The numbers matched too well. My father had held guardianship access to that account while I was a minor, and he had used it. The money that was supposed to help secure my future, money my mother's family had set aside specifically for me, had been quietly redirected to build the life my father wanted Derek to have. All those years he had told me I lacked discipline, that I hadn't tried hard enough, that some people just weren't built for certain paths. He had been saying those things while standing on the foundation of a future he had stolen from me and handed to someone else's son. I sat with that knowledge for 2 days before I did anything. Not because I was uncertain, because I wanted to be precise. When I drove to my father's house on Christmas Eve, I knew exactly who everyone in that house believed they were in the story. Derek was the success. Mia was the proof his life looked impressive from the outside. Robert and Sandra were the proud architects of a thriving son. And I was still the cautionary footnote, the side note they kept available to make him shine brighter by comparison. The house looked like a magazine layout. Garland on the staircase. Expensive glass ornaments on a tree that had probably been professionally decorated. Candles in every room. The kitchen smelled like roasting meat and cinnamon. And before I had even removed my coat, Sandra was handing me an apron and asking me to help plate the appetizers because Mia was coming and everything needed to look nice. Not because I was a guest. Because in that house I had always been part daughter and part unpaid staff, and some things never update themselves. Derek arrived late, which I suspected was intentional. He had always understood how to make an entrance. He came through the door with Mia on his arm, and the body language of a man who had never once imagined a room might eventually turn against him. My father opened his best bourbon. Sandra practically glowed. Everyone crowded around them like moths around the only light source in the room. Then Derek saw me standing near the dining room entrance, still wearing the apron, still holding the serving tray, and that smile appeared, the one he had been perfecting since childhood, the one that made cruelty look like personality. He wrapped his arm tighter around Mia, turned to face the room and said loudly and clearly, "This is my sister Lily, the failure of our family." The laughter came so fast it almost sounded rehearsed. My father laughed first the way he always had, quick, comfortable, like he was agreeing with something that had already been decided. Sandra followed with a light, knowing smile. Even the people who didn't know me offered polite little laughs, because cruelty wrapped in cheerfulness reads as a joke to anyone who doesn't feel the blade. Mia gave a small, uncertain smile. The kind that says I sense something is wrong here, but I don't yet understand the depth of it. I stood there holding that serving tray, wearing that apron, in a house that had never once treated me like I fully belonged in it. And I felt something I hadn't expected. Absolute calm. Not the defeated kind. Not the kind you build by suppressing everything until you go numb. The kind that comes when you've already prepared, and you're simply waiting for the signal. I set the tray down on the nearest surface. I reached into my apron pocket. I opened my phone, found the message thread with Marcus, and typed 2 words we had agreed on weeks earlier. Do it. I pressed send. Then I put my phone away and waited. 53 seconds later, I counted, Derek's phone rang. He answered with a grin still on his face, expecting a holiday call from someone in his expanding professional network. The grin began to dissolve somewhere around the 3rd sentence. By the time he pulled the phone slightly away from his ear, his face had lost all its color. His jaw was tight. His eyes moved around the room without landing on anything. Marcus's voice was calm, direct, and final. He had practiced this and it showed. Derek, Your employment at Apex Creative Group is terminated effective immediately. Your system access has been fully revoked. You will be contacted separately by HR and legal counsel regarding the theft of intellectual property, fraudulent vendor reimbursements, and the deliberate destruction of internal documentation. Do not contact staff members. Do not attempt to access company systems. This call is being recorded. The room had gone completely silent. My father stood up from his chair so quickly it scraped backward across the hardwood floor. Derek began talking over the call, his voice climbing, insisting there had been a misunderstanding, that whoever was responsible for this decision didn't have the full picture, that he deserved to speak to someone with actual authority. Marcus said, "You may want to look at the television." I had already mirrored the evidence file from my phone to the living room screen. The television lit up with access logs and timestamps, document version histories showing the original files in my name, then the renamed copies in Derek's. Reimbursement records traced back to the Shell account. Recovered deleted files. Chat screenshots showing Derek joking to colleagues about rescuing his sister's ideas. And then, at the end of the document sequence, the one thing I had saved for last. Apex Creative Group. Ownership structure. My name. Majority shareholder. 71%. The silence in that room was the most complete silence I had ever heard inside those walls. Mia stepped away from Derek. Not dramatically. Just quietly, incrementally, like the floor beside him had shifted and she was finding better ground. Her face was composed but her eyes were doing the math in real time. My father said impossible under his breath, then said it again louder, as if volume might correct the screen. Sandra stared at me with an expression I had never seen on her face in 14 years. The stunned, recalibrating look of someone who has suddenly discovered that the person they trained themselves not to see has been standing in a room they built. Derek, when he finally spoke, did the most Derek thing he could have done. He turned mean. He said I had baited him, manipulated the system, weaponized a family relationship to destroy his career out of jealousy. He said I had always been jealous because he was the one our father actually believed in, the one who actually delivered, the one who had earned everything he received while I had spent my entire adult life nursing a grudge about choices I had made. I looked at him for a long moment. "You're right about one thing," I said. "You were the one he believed in. And I spent years thinking that meant something was wrong with me. Turns out it just meant something was wrong with him." I looked at my father when I said that last part. He didn't respond. He just sat back down slowly, like the effort of standing had become too much. The following morning, Robert and Sandra arrived at my apartment together. They brought a manila folder, a personal check, and the tone people use when they want to bury a crime inside the concept of family. The folder contained a proposed settlement, a property share, an early inheritance disbursement, and language releasing all parties from further legal or financial claims. Buried inside the fine print were references to custodial accounts and estate-adjacent funds connected to my mother's assets. They sat across from me at my kitchen table like they were doing me a favor by showing up. My Aunt Diane arrived 20 minutes later. She had driven 2 hours and she was carrying copied bank statements she had obtained through her own research after I'd called her the week before and told her what I had found. She laid them on the table between us and my father's face went gray. The statements showed, in clean numerical language, the systematic withdrawal of funds from the custodial education account my maternal grandparents had established for me, an account my father had maintained access to as my legal guardian. The withdrawals tracked almost perfectly against the timeline of Derek's private university costs, his housing deposits, his vehicle purchases, and the various financial lifts the family had provided him during those years while telling me I needed to learn independence. My mother's family had intended that money for me. My father had spent it on someone else's son. Sandra, to her credit, did not attempt to deny it cleanly. What she said was that they had made practical decisions based on where they believed the investment would yield the best outcome, and that Derek had demonstrated more readiness at the time. Practical. I laughed. It came out sharper than I intended and it seemed to startle everyone in the room, including me. Then I picked up the proposed settlement, held it for exactly as long as it took me to read the first page, and tore it in half lengthwise. Then I tore it again. I set the pieces on the table between us and told them, as calmly as I could manage, that they did not get to buy my silence with pieces of what they had already stolen, that this conversation was over, that the next one would happen through attorneys. My father tried to speak. I stood up and pointed at the door. They left. What came after was not clean or cinematic. It was paperwork and depositions and long phone calls with attorneys, and the particular exhaustion that comes from dismantling a lie that has been reinforced for decades. But it was also, for the first time in my life, entirely on my terms. Derek, for his part, attempted one final play. He and my father coordinated a quiet campaign of anonymous posts across industry forums and social media. Vague, carefully worded accusations designed to make me look unstable, vindictive, and professionally unreliable. The posts hinted at internal misconduct, manipulated records, a hostile work environment built on personal grudges. The goal was to muddy the water enough that clients might hesitate and my credibility might soften before the legal proceedings gained traction. It was, in retrospect, the most desperate thing either of them had ever done. And it was also the most clarifying. Because this time I didn't defend myself with emotion. I defended myself with documentation. Cease and desist letters went to every platform within 48 hours. Legal counsel contacted both my father and Derek directly, naming them as the identifiable sources and outlining the specific liability attached to defamation and tortious interference with business relations. The posts disappeared within days. Every single one. Clients who mattered stayed because when the question came up directly, I had records and receipts and a paper trail that told a cleaner story than anything they tried to manufacture. Derek was blacklisted from reputable agency work within the region. The word traveled the way bad reputations do in industries where people talk over lunch, quietly, thoroughly, and without much sympathy for the person it concerned. Mia ended the relationship within weeks. She released a brief, dignified statement to mutual friends about needing to align herself with people whose integrity she could trust, and then she got on with her life in a way that suggested she had been looking for an exit before Christmas had even arrived. My father and stepmother became the subject of a formal financial review tied to the estate mismanagement. The exposure was significant: tax irregularities connected to the account management, undisclosed transfers that created inheritance complications for other parties in my mother's family, and enough documentation to keep their attorneys occupied and their social confidence thoroughly deflated for the foreseeable future. Their world got smaller. Their phone stopped ringing the way it used to. The version of themselves they had curated for the neighborhood and the extended family circle, the proud, successful parents of a rising son, quietly came apart. I did not celebrate any of it publicly. I didn't post. I didn't send messages. I didn't arrange for anyone to witness my relief. I did something better. 1 year after that Christmas dinner, I hosted the holiday in a different home, one I had chosen, furnished, and filled with people who had never once required me to make myself smaller for their comfort. We cooked too much food. We laughed too loudly. We stayed at the table for 3 hours after the meal because nobody was performing anything and nobody wanted the evening to end. In the afternoon before dinner, we loaded boxes into the back of 2 cars and drove to a local food bank where we volunteered for a distribution shift. I wanted that day to mean something other than hierarchy and humiliation. I wanted to replace the memory of what Christmas had always felt like in that house with something that actually resembled the holiday's stated purpose. Standing in that parking lot in the cold, handing bags to people who were genuinely grateful, I thought about everything it had taken to arrive at that particular moment. Not just the legal battles or the professional victories or the evidence files and the terminated access logs. I thought about the apartment above the diner, the garbage bags full of clothes, the library books, the cash-paid logo for the barbecue stand, the $200 nail salon job. Every single moment I had kept moving without anyone's permission or support or belief, building something out of materials nobody had bothered to offer me. The lesson took almost 3 decades to fully land. Blood is not permission. Family is not ownership. And love that only exists when you stay beneath someone is not love. It's leverage. It's a power structure dressed in the language of affection. And the moment you stop cooperating with it, the whole thing reveals itself for exactly what it always was. If you have ever been cast as the failure in someone else's story, I want you to hear this clearly. Sometimes the role was never yours. Sometimes it was written for you by people who needed your silence to protect their own lives, their own choices, their own carefully maintained fictions. They handed you that label and then stood back and waited for you to grow into it, Because a version of you that stays small and broken is far more useful to them than a version of you that stands up. Walking away from that is not cruelty. It is not ingratitude. It is not drama. It is self-respect. It is the beginning of an honest life. And building something real. Something rooted in your own work, your own integrity, your own willingness to keep going when the people who should have caught you let you fall, will always matter more than being chosen as the favorite in a dishonest home. I learned that too late to save my childhood, but not too late to save the rest of my life.